Now, let me introduce to you the science panel. Dr. Bethanie Carney Almroth, who is Assistant Professor in Environmental Science at the University of Gothenburg. A big round of applause. Welcome. Dr. Toste Tanhua, who's leading the science program during Volvo Ocean Race. Welcome. And Dr. Ivone Mirpuri, who is Medical Advisor at Mirpuri Foundation. Welcome. Welcome, all three of you. Now, diving into the science issue a bit deeper. Bethanie, you've been studying effects of microplastics. We heard Marcus here tell us a little bit about that in the sea. He explained a bit why it's dangerous. We don't know very much of the effects of microplastics yet. Why not?
We're starting to understand a little bit of what can happen in lab studies, but microplastics is not one thing, it's many things. So there's a lot of different kinds of polymers. So you saw on the chart that Marcus put up, there's a really big size range, and something that's a nanometer size will have a very different biological impact than something that's bigger, microplastics, or even millimeter-sized plastics. But plastics also are chemicals. And they can contain a lot of additives, a lot of environmental chemicals binding. So they're really complex particles. And we don't really know if we're working with a particle effect or a polymer effect or a chemical effect. So we're trying to tease apart all these questions to find a story of what's going on. And it's a lot of small questions that we're addressing.
But you know that microplastics are dangerous. And I know you give advice to Swedish authorities in this issue. What advice do you give to them?
Well, that's a hard question because we don't really have all the answers. And as was pointed out before, we need to have good science to make good policy decisions. So what I can do is just sort of update on where we are now and what we know now and try to put that into a context, which is not always easy because the context is also complex, but try to really to explain what we know and what we know about chemicals and what we know about particles and sources are really important to talk about. Where are they coming from? And once they're out there, we can't really get them back. So we need to start looking at sources, land to sea sources, and try to prevent them from getting into the environment.
What kind of questions do you get from the authorities? What do they want to know?
Should I stop eating blue mussels? Mm-hmm. Mussels are filter feeders that take up more particles than a fish does, for example.
And should we?
Not for that reason, I would argue. We don't, and we'll hear soon from a doctor, but I don't think that we're at a place right now where we can say that microplastic exposure through seafood is a problem. Because if I can just give a quick example of a study that my group did. So we took water, because we've heard that microplastic is in products, and it's in our drinking water. And we know, so we looked at Swedish drinking water up here at our marine station. We found about 4 microplastics in the tap water. And then we took our ultra-pure, ultra-clean water that was high filtered water in a clean room and found a microplastic in that. So we were unable to work without contaminating our samples, which in and of itself says a lot. And then we also took a glass of water and put it on the table and stood next to it wearing a fleece sweatshirt. And there we found 15 particles. So plastics are really ubiquitous in our entire environment, and our exposure pathways are through everyday life, through our indoor and outdoor environments, through everything we eat. So that blue mussel is probably not your biggest problem.
You have a lot of other problems, and more research is needed in this issue. Dr. Toste, what are the most significant observations you've done during the science program?
So we have found a lot of plastics all over. We have only 2 samples out of the 53 that didn't have any plastics. I think that really shows you the scale of the problem. We have plastics, microplastics in the subsurface layer around the world. We found much more plastics close to the coast, around the Mediterranean, South China Sea, and some other places where big ocean currents are bringing plastics from far away. So it shows really where we have very local plastic. From one position to the next can vary a lot. So there are small-scale variations of the plastic distribution. So that, I think, is the most important conclusion. Plastic is everywhere, unfortunately.
It's everywhere, yes. Yeah. So it's a big problem. Now, you've organized this science program in a consortium. Can you tell us a little bit how it's organized and how you can actually spread and use this model in other...
So as a scientist, it's fantastic to be working with these partners, Volvo Ocean Race, who let us come on the boats and do these measurements and been very kind in kind support of actually making it happen. Volvo Cars actually been very supportive of purchasing the instrumentation. And we have a science fund from the German science ministry to actually carry out the science. And that together with a couple of small companies that develop some new instrumentation, and we're working then with United Nations agencies on different range. So what Marcus was mentioning here just before on how to measure plastics. But some of the science program that we haven't really talked about here is the operational services that we do. We actually providing real-time data that goes into weather forecasting from the race. So the ocean is actually driving a lot of the climate and the weather. And we really need this data from far away to make a really good weather forecast on short term and on long term. We also measuring carbon dioxide. The ocean is taking up about a third of the anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide. So the data from the boats are actually providing some insights on where and how much the ocean is taking up carbon dioxide. And that leads to the next problem. When the carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, the seawater gets acidified, lower pH, which is bad for organisms, particularly if they make calcium carbonate shells like corals.
So you found quite a few problems.
There are many problems, and we're trying to be in that space where we get the information that you need to manage the ocean, to create a sustainable ocean.
So lots of data that you now are going to analyze and...
So all the data, the carbon dioxide and temperature, it's actually online, and we get it right away. And the plastic data is something that we have to take back to the lab in Kiel. And just after this meeting here, I'm going to go down to the boatyard and pick up the filters that they took on Lake 10, bring them back to Kiel.
Dr. Ivone, you are a medical doctor and you're treating hormonal imbalances every day. Do you see a difference? What do you see now that you actually didn't see a couple of years ago?
Good morning, everybody. I've been a doctor for 34 years, and what I see today is very different from what I used to see 10 years ago. Fertility has decreased 50% in the last 50 years. This happens because it's not only about the plastics, but because of all the other endocrine disruptor chemicals that we have in nature, because of microplastics, that contain substances that interfere with the hormonal system. The hormones act in receptors, and the substances that are in plastic and on the other hormonal endocrine disruptors go to the receptor instead of the hormone, and then they can interfere with the synthesis, the transport, the metabolism, the production of the hormone. So illness appear. And for instance, early puberty, how many of you know people, girls getting their periods at 15 and 16? None. Usually we see early puberty at the age of 8 and 9. And menopause that I used to see in the 50s, I see now in the 40s. Something is changing. And also other diseases like autism, mood disorders, thyroid issues. If we take only clinical symptoms for a diagnosis, we can have 85% of population diagnosed with hypothyroidism, with the tiredness, anxiety, depression, fatigue, weight gain. And so, but when you do laboratory tests, you only have less than 8%. So even other diseases like heart disease and diabetes, you used to classify diabetes type 2 as an adult onset disease. And now we can see it at the age of 5. It's incredible what we are seeing today. And cancers like prostate cancer, breast cancer, pancreatic cancer, and also testicular cancer has increased the rate of 400% since 1943 because of environment problems that we can cause in the laboratory animals. So although we can't say that it's because of plastic, and although we can't do experiments on people, we can do all of the illnesses using plastic components and other endocrine disruptors on animal laboratories. So regardless of what you may read in mainstream sources, things are changing and we must act urgently. We are at the 11th hour to do
So
something.
you can see the sense of urgency, a lot of things changing. What can we do to prevent this, to actually...
I could say we live in the chemical world, They are there and they are useful, and we just need a rational approach to balance between, to achieve a balance between usefulness and risks to our health. I can tell you that food is the major source of chemical in our bodies. So eat unprocessed organic foods. Then you don't know how are they watered. Maybe they don't have pesticides and insecticides, but you don't know about the water they are having. So go to the local market, don't microwave in plastic, never, and buy food in metal and glass containers using reusable metal container for water and other liquids. I could tell you check labels, but then when there are labels, they are diminutes with small print and incomprehensible for most of the average persons. So we need a political regulatory action. We need the governments to be involved. We need laws that require that chemicals should be tested before they go on the market, would be also very important. We need to...
Yes.
I have lots of
Oh, you have lots of advices. That's good. Let's come back to you. Let's actually, before we come back to you on the advice part, see if you have any questions from the room. Or maybe we should start, Gustav, with Twitter. Is there anything to bring up on the panel?
No, we actually don't have any questions, but a lot of people are quoting all the speakers on stage, and I think the message is not staying in this room. It's actually reaching the world outside this room and the tent and the city. So that's great.
It's good that more than us
sir.
300. Yes, we have a question there. If you turn around, we'll get you a microphone as well.
Good morning, thank you. My name is Keith Freegard. I come from the UK. I recycle motor vehicles, and here there's a car with some of my recycled plastic on it, so that's a pretty good thing. The science is really good, and I thought the words that struck me today was togetherness and responsibility, 2 words earlier from Jan. And generally, I think the people in this room, looking around, look like the type of people who do a really good job at recycling their plastics and other packaging at home, and then it goes off from your curbside and you forget about it. My big concern on the science, and I saw a really good graph earlier of the dots on the trip around the world. It was up for about 5 seconds. I wanted to look at it for 5 minutes. If we're collecting all this stuff in Europe and it disappears out of our normal life, our belief is that it then gets responsibly recycled and turned back into new things. But the evidence I've seen, certainly in the UK, suggests that a massive tonnage of what we collect at our curbside is ending up being exported across the sea. Ocean conference, really good. We export most of our waste on containers, and that used to go to China. Sorry, this is such a long question. Now China's shut their doors, that's going to all the other countries, Vietnam, Laos, Malaysia, where the standards of waste management are very low. So my question for the panel is, what science do we have that follows the mass balance of the material that we put in our bins, that our governments are responsible for, and yet 65% of it is being exported to those countries in Asia? Where does the waste fraction go from that?
Do we know anything about where the waste ends up, basically, is your question to the science panel?
Yeah,
because this is also a question for, I can say, for the minister, and we'll bring her up later on. But this is the science panel, and you want to know if
Is
they
there
know.
any good science about the huge tonnage that flows across our oceans to those countries that gets poorly recycled in low-grade MRFs in those countries, and a massive amount of the waste, which would have to be dealt with responsibly in Europe, must end up in all the rivers that are delivering the waste into the ocean?
So let's see if the panel... Yes, Toste, do you have any answer to that?
So the question is that we just don't really know.
Don't know.
The data we are collecting during Volvo Ocean Race is one way towards understanding. And like Marcus was alluding to, from all the plastic that we know ends up in the ocean on an annual basis, we can account for about 1% of that in total. So we really don't know, and we need more science. It seems like a lot of it actually ends up on the seafloor. I've seen videos taken by deep sea submergible from 6,000 meters depth. We see it looks like a beach in Indonesia, full of plastics, and that's probably what ends up. So we really need that information. It is completely unresponsible to send the plastic to China or other developing countries or underdeveloped countries to take care of it. We need to do that, and I think in Sweden we have actually particularly good system of taking care of this waste, and we are actually importing, or as somebody would like to say, we are exporting a service to other countries that don't have that technology. And I really wish that we could export that technology to many countries. So the answer to the problem is turn off the tap, and we need a responsible waste treatment systems around the world.
So in Sweden, we're importing to recycle, basically.
There is import, so now we are not the China of the world, but we're actually importing, and when it comes to Sweden, it actually gets taken care of in a good way.
Bethanie.
I'd like to quickly address another aspect of plastic recycling, because in Sweden we do recycle a lot, and we also do a lot of what's commonly referred to as energy recycling, which means we incinerate the plastics. And that's because the plastics are a very complex group of different materials, and you can't mix polystyrene and polypropylene in a product downstream. And that requires really advanced recycling technologies that can separate the polymers from one another and that's able to reuse these materials. And that is further hindered by the use of chemicals. So chemicals in one product, in one life stage, in a car, for example, where flame retardants are really important and useful, can't be recycled to something that is going to be played with by a child, because then that chemical is potentially dangerous and toxic. And we have to really look at how we're using chemicals and where we're using chemicals. And knowledge about what kinds of chemicals are in the plastic products that we're using is really difficult to come by. So a consumer can't read on a label what kinds of chemicals are in their plastics that they're purchasing in a store. That information is not available. And those decisions can't be made by consumers. They need to be made at a higher level in society with regulation and accountability for production and use.
So, closing this panel, taking in what you're saying about the sense of urgency we should have in this issue, Bethanie, what would be your advice?
We need to really look at how we're using plastics and how we're using chemicals in plastics. And I will continue to research microplastics to really try to understand the effects, the mechanisms of the effects, and try to get enough data to extrapolate that to what's happening in the ocean, because we can't do that right now. I can tell you what's happening in the lab, but I can't say what's happening in the ocean. And really to look at the way we're using these materials in society, because the macroplastics are really the sources of microplastics.
And Toste.
So we really need to understand the problem. So we need to understand what the 99% of the plastic that we don't know where it is, actually where it is. And we have to take a choice individually to not use plastic if we don't have to. And we have a good opportunity to influence people around us, stakeholders, governments, or your local grocery store to use less plastic, and your neighbor. It starts there. It starts from the, think global, act local. I think that's a good saying that still is valid.
And everybody can do something. Ivone, you were treating hormonal imbalances. Do you have any special advice for pregnant women?
Yes, because pregnancy is the only time the mother will have to make a good body and a good brain for her baby. And beside all the things that I should have time to say that I didn't, I would give a special advice with the water, because the plastic bottle has lead, antimony, and phthalates, and lead can cause cerebral damage, brain damage for the baby, and it's going to be the brain that the baby will have for the rest of his life. And so mothers should be very careful about the water they drink. They could have a special filter, and even when pregnancy should be thought as a moment very special. And when we are speaking about endocrine disruptors, we can't think about only one, because at every moment we have 200 toxic substances inside of us. So we have a mixed effect. So it's only because it's small dose doesn't matter, it matters, because when the risks go up when we take mixed effects into considerations, and that must be very important. And also because chemicals act, hormones act at a very small doses in the receptors. Also, the chemicals in the environment, even in small doses, can cause a detrimental effect on the body. So
no plastic bottled water for pregnant women.
For nobody.
For nobody.
But special for pregnancy. They are recycled, but they shouldn't be reused because every time the time goes by, they leach more chemicals inside, and it will be more and more dangerous.
So no plastic bottled water for anybody, and it's good we have another solution in the race village.
Yes.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for joining us here today. Thank you. Thank you.